I'm Arnold Michaelis.
16 months before his assassination, I visited with Martin Luther King Jr. at his home in Atlanta. Our conversation ranged over a wide variety of subjects: the Vietnam War, his role as leader in the struggle for equality among peoples, the march from Selma to Montgomery, his religious beliefs as a Baptist minister, as well as his personal philosophy, and his role as a husband and father. I first met Martin Luther King Jr. in New York just after Thanksgiving of 1965. The following day, we flew together to his home in Atlanta. During the flight, we had the opportunity for some relaxed conversation, mainly about how progressive Atlanta had been in the area of civil rights.
That's generally true. Atlanta has been certainly one of the most reasonable and good sense communities in the South. It has adjusted to the change with amazing good sense, and I think Atlanta has led the way in so many areas, and we feel very good about this.
Well, I think it was very thoughtful of you to be born here in that case. How did you manage that?
Well, I thank my parents for the opportunity. They are native Georgians, and my mother is a native of Atlanta. My father, a native of Stockbridge, Georgia, which is just about 16 miles from Atlanta. So I grew up right here in this city, went to high school, college here, and of course, now I'm back pastoring as well as heading the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which has its headquarters here.
Yes. Well, now you're also going to become involved with integrating another facet of community life in Alabama, namely the Braves.
Yes, here in Atlanta.
Yes.
And I think this will be another very good step forward. We will also have a professional football team here, and with the Braves coming and football team called Falcons, I think this again will continue to make Atlanta a city that looks forward and moves forward and recognizes that change is upon us.
Well, now, with the Braves coming here from Milwaukee, is that going to give you any difficulty in rooting for them? Had you had a favorite team other than the Braves before?
Well, I think now I'll have to root for the Braves because of my devotion to Atlanta. I haven't been a Brave fan in the past. I guess I started out being a Dodger fan, mainly because Jackie Robinson has been a good friend across the years. And as you know, he was the first Negro to enter baseball, professional baseball, in major leagues. And I was deeply moved by the fact that Branch Rickey was willing to be this courageous. And so I've been a Dodger fan, but I'm going to get with the Braves now.
In the years since I talked with Martin Luther King Jr., a great deal has changed in the world, in the civil rights movement, even in the language. Then it was Negro and colored. Now it's black. In April of 1965, Martin and Coretta bought a house in Atlanta. It wasn't a new house, but they furnished it with a lot of love for what was to be their last 3 years together. This included their 4 children: Yolanda, the eldest, nicknamed Yoki; Martin, the third, Marty; Dexter, the youngest son; and Bernice, no longer the baby, called Bonnie. And here was the moment to bypass the public image and get to the private person of Martin Luther King Jr.
Now, in terms of Vietnam, which certainly has become the most overriding problem facing the country, it was indicated in many newspaper editorials that you had gotten out of bounds, that you were out of your depth, that you were out of place, that you were out of line. It's all very well to have humanitarian feelings, but the civil rights movement is your essential identification to the public, and your occupation and profession is the pulpit. Now, what made you feel that you had a right to deal or want to deal directly with the heads of government and in a way to circumvent government action here in the United States?
Well, let me say first why I got involved in the Vietnam situation and felt that I had to take a stand. And I might say that for a good while I remained rather silent on this matter and decided that I would concentrate in the civil rights area and not even make public statements or any pronouncements on Vietnam. For another period, knowing that my wife shares my passion for peace, I decided that I would leave it to her to take the stands and make the meetings on the peace issue and leave me to concentrate on civil rights. But I came to the conclusion that there is that existential moment, so to speak, in your life where you must decide and speak for yourself, that nobody else can speak for you. And you come to the point of facing your own conscience on a matter that you know is so significant and so destiny-making. And this is the conclusion that I came to about Vietnam, that I could no longer be a silent onlooker, a sort of detached spectator, but that in some real way I had to be an involved and concerned participant. I'm a minister of the gospel, and I take this ministry very seriously. And my ministry, as well as any genuine ministry, has not only a priestly function, but a prophetic function. And I think it is forever my responsibility as a clergyman to seek to bring the ethical insights of our Judeo-Christian heritage to bear on the social evils of our day. And I happen to consider war a social evil that has ominous possibilities for the total annihilation of mankind.
Very true, but I would like to try to clarify a point here, because I realize the depth of your conviction about your participation in this whole situation, quite apart from any overtones of church and state conflict. And it just occurred to me as you were talking that this must have been part, even subconsciously, of the thinking of some of the editorial writers who may have resented your entrance into the discussion of the problem, that you're essentially representing the church, and we in the United States are very conscious of keeping that separation between the two. But in your books, Stride Toward Freedom, which is the story, and a very dramatic story of the Montgomery bus boycott, you wrote this: I felt that while war could never be a positive nor absolute good, it could serve as a negative good in the sense of preventing the spread and growth of an evil force. War, horrible as it is, might be preferable to surrender to a totalitarian system, Nazi, fascist, or communist. Now, since we're supposed to be fighting communism in Vietnam, how can you relate these two statements to the statement that you made just a few moments ago about war being a deplorable thing that could lead us to total annihilation?
Well, I would say two things to this. First, in the Vietnam situation, there can be no gainsaying of the fact that we have taken a stand against a people seeking self-determination. If one looks back over the history of this war, there are many things that turn out to be very ugly, and I'm absolutely convinced that there is some wrong on both sides, and I don't think we should ignore the wrong on our side. The fact is that the Republic of Vietnam declared itself independent in 1945, and we didn't even recognize it then, and this was before Communist China came into being. Then the French sought to recapture their former colony and engaged in a war for 7 or 8 years.
At great cost. It almost weakened.
Yes, we supported it to the tune of more than $3 billion. And then with the Geneva Accord in 1954, which we were a part of to a degree, we didn't
but
really
not officially.
sign it.
We didn't sign it.
And after that, it's very interesting that President Johnson made a statement at that time, as Senate Majority Leader, that he could not condone an act that would send American boys to Asian soil to perpetuate a war, to participate in a war that would perpetuate white colonialism. Now, shortly after that, President Eisenhower and Mr. Dulles had to take some stands on this issue, and Mr. Diem came into power and used very repressive methods against the people.
President Diem, who was
yes,
at that time head of the government of South Vietnam.
That's right, exactly. And as a result of these oppressive methods, the Viet Cong came into being with power and force to try to bring all of these issues out in the open. And we just watched that war constantly escalated. I never will forget when I read Mein Kampf, Hitler talked about peace and talked about everything he was doing was for peace. Mussolini talked about peace. All of the leaders and heads of nations today talk about peace. Everything they do, they say, they are doing it for peaceful ends. I think the great problem here is that too often we think of peace as a goal that we seek rather than a means by which we arrive at that goal. And certainly war is a poor chisel to carve out peaceful tomorrows. Ultimately, we've got to see that if we're going to have peace in the world, we've got to use peaceful means to get there. And the tragedy is that we talk about peace in lofty terms, but we're using war as a means to get there.
Now, how do you see this whole thing resolving? What would you do if you were given the opportunity to speak for the president?
Well, first, I would get my whole perspective, I would try anyway, to get my whole perspective right. And that is, I would seek to depend on the moral power of our nation more than the military power. We don't have to prove our military power. This is a great tragedy that we are trying to prove our military power. Everybody knows that we are the most powerful country in the world. We have the most powerful military machinery in history. We must do something creative to create the atmosphere for negotiation. Let's take Vietnam. We say we are for unconditional talks. And I don't think President Johnson is a warmonger. I think he's caught in a very difficult dilemma. He inherited a great deal of this problem. And I'm not one to spend a great deal of time condemning President Johnson. I have great personal admiration for him. I'm trying to deal with an issue, and I hope that we will be able to arouse the conscience of the nation enough to cause him to do what I consider the right thing. If we could get rid of our pride, and this is a word that I think America must hear more and more, that we've got to get rid of our pride. It won't hurt us morally. It isn't going to hurt us from a military point of view to pull out of Vietnam in some way. And my contention is that we've got to face the fact that communism is a reality in our world. And this does not mean we accept the philosophy of communism. This does not mean that we go along with what I consider its ethical relativism and its metaphysical materialism and its crippling totalitarianism. But the fact is that communism is here, it's with us, and as somebody has said, it must be peaceful coexistence or no existence. My statement, I would still say that I have great philosophical opposition to communism as a system, but I'm not going to hate communists, and I'm not going to engage in any campaign which will not recognize the fact that communism is a political system that many people in our world will choose to follow. And I believe enough in freedom of choice and freedom of speech and assembly and all of these things to take a stand against any move that would carry us down a negative path. The other thing that I'd like to point out here, which I think is important, following this other point in the book, there was a time in my intellectual pilgrimage that I was...
Nice way of putting it.
Yes. But there was a time when I felt that war was or could be a negative good. I never felt that war could be a positive good, but I felt, as I said in the passage that you read, that war could be a negative good in that it could block the spread of some negative evil force, like a Hitler, for instance, who comes into history and is so misguided and sick that he leads the whole world down a tragic path. But as I continued to think through this thing, I came to pacifism through a very pragmatic point. In other words, to just looking at the practical consequences of war. I came to the conclusion that war could no longer serve as a negative good because of the potential destructiveness and the actual destructiveness of modern weapons of warfare.
I think our concepts today, some of which go back to the early teachings, which is your area again, is that one life is all life, or represents all life. One life destroyed by violence indicates the ultimate totality of all life being destroyed by violence.
We've got to have disarmament if we're going to survive. As I've said often, today it's no longer a choice between violence and nonviolence. It's either nonviolence or non-existence. And I feel that we've got to look at this total thing anew and recognize that we must live together, that the whole world now is one, not only geographically, but it has to become one in terms of brotherly concern. And we are, whether we live in America, whether we live in Asia or Africa, we are tied in a single garment of destiny, and whatever affects one directly affects all of us indirectly. I'm concerned about living with my conscience and searching for that which is right and that which is true. And I cannot live with the idea of being just a conformist, following a path that everybody else follows. And I think this has happened to us, as I've said in one of my books, that so often we will live by the philosophy that everybody's doing it and it must be all right. We tend to determine what is right and wrong by taking a sort of Gallup poll of the majority opinion. And I don't think this is the way to get at what is right. Arnold Toynbee talks about the creative minority. And I think more and more we must have in our world that creative minority that will take a stand for that which conscience tells them is right, even though it brings about criticism and misunderstanding and even abuse. So that I intend to continue to stand up on this question because I think I'm right and I think I'm following the dictates of my conscience on it. And as I read about the prophets, the great prophets of the Old Testament and the great prophets through the ages, they have been men who have taken a stand for what they felt was revealed to them by God and what they felt was true. And it brought them criticism. Sometimes they were stoned and murdered.
Sometimes crucified.
But they stood up for it because it was right. I think one of the great tragedies now is that we are confusing dissent with disloyalty and calling everybody who engages in protest a traitor. And this just isn't true because most of us are motivated by a love for America and a desire to see our country do the right thing in this situation as in all situations.
Well, Dr. King, apparently the committee or the board which decides who is to receive the Nobel Peace Prize must have felt similarly about your convictions, because I'm sure it was on that basis that they made the award. Now, I don't know what the current world population is of Nobel Prize winners. Maybe you could help me. Do you know by any chance how many living brethren you have with whom you share this distinction?
I think it's about 37 now.
Well, you're a pretty select group. I think you're about the third Nobel Prize winner I've been privileged to meet. But I must say I've never met the award. I've only met the recipient. And I was curious as to what was on the award and what it looked like. And I asked Mrs. King about it earlier. And I hope that you will forgive her for having handed it to me.
Oh, that's perfectly all right.
I didn't want to embarrass you by asking you about it, but I gather that this is the scroll.
That's right.
And I have never seen the scroll, and I wonder if you'd be kind enough to show it to me and explain it to me.
Yes, we're going to.
Because my knowledge of Swedish is abysmal.
The scroll, simply, and of course it's beautifully set forth here.
By hand, obviously.
Yes, by hand, And it simply states that the Norwegian Parliament, starting really is a parliament of Norway, and it's simply stating that the Parliament selected me for the Nobel Peace Prize, which was presented in December the 10th to be exact, in Oslo. It mentions the date, the 27th of November
1895, yes.
Which I think, as I recall, must have been the time that Nobel made the will for all of the Nobel
That's right.
Prizes.
By the way, I said Swedish before, obviously. I meant Norwegian.
Yes.
But I'm on safe ground because my ignorance of Norwegian is easily akin to that of my ignorance of Swedish. But I do make out the word testament here next to this date of 27 November 1895, so it must have been the result of his will and testament.
Yes, that's right.
Now, what date was this presented to you?
It was presented on the 10th of December.
I see.
That's the date that all of the Nobel Prizes are presented. Of course, the Peace Prize is in Norway, when all of the other prizes are presented in Stockholm, Sweden.
Yes. And then this is the medallion I
Yes,
see.
Which has on it as you can see, this is Nobel himself, Alfred Nobel himself. And it's very beautiful and something.
And very heavy.
Yes, very heavy. Yes, that's right.
Now, I noticed at one point in your writings you had mentioned when you were some years younger that you had felt as though a curtain had descended upon your selfhood. It was an interesting observation about oneself. And I wondered what kind of feeling descended upon you at the moment that you received these awards, the Nobel Peace Prize. Can you recapture it with me?
Well, this was naturally a very high mountaintop experience. I guess at points I had a mixed response. On the one hand, I thought about the fact at this moment that we had conducted a struggle in the United States on a nonviolent scale that had somewhat electrified the world and gained world attention. And of course, when I received the award, I made it very clear that I didn't consider it merely an honor to me personally. It was much larger than that. I think it was a real honor and a tribute to the civil rights movement itself and all of the nameless, anonymous, faceless individuals who have worked so passionately and unrelentingly for a reign of justice and a rule of love in this country. And I couldn't help but think when I received the award of the thousands of people who started out with me in Montgomery, Alabama, for instance, back in 1955 when we started the bus boycott. I thought of Rosa Parks, who really sparked that boycott. I thought of the thousands and thousands of Negro and white students who have worked in such a devoted manner to achieve justice in our country. And so that this was one aspect of the feeling. On the other hand, I could not help but think at that moment about the fact that I was receiving an award for something that had not yet been achieved in the United States and in the world. I had to think of the fact that even though I was receiving a Peace Prize, we were still having tragic bombings in Mississippi and murders in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and other places. And I had to think of the fact that people were still dying in war all over the world. So that it made me more determined to return to the scene of action in the United States and do more to try to solve the problems, and also to look at the world situation and try to give whatever I could give, use whatever influence I have to try to make peace a reality. So I came right back, and I never will forget that about 2 or 3 weeks after, 2 weeks really to be exact, after receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, I was down in Selma, Alabama, where we started a struggle which ended with the writing of a voting rights bill.
In connection with Selma, Dr. King, I remember you stated at one point that you would rather die on the highways of Alabama than be guilty of butchery of your conscience. What specific thing prompted you to make that statement? Do you remember?
That was a moment, the period rather, when we were getting ready to march from Selma to Montgomery. We faced opposition from the local police force, the local sheriff and the sheriff's office, as well as from the governor of the state of Alabama. And they were determined for us not to have this march. Now, I made this statement after the Sunday march, which ended in so much violence. When we decided to go on and march Tuesday, which was 2 days later, there was still great opposition, and we were getting pressure from many forces, even the federal government, to hold back because the issue was at that time in court. And it was at that point that I said I would rather die on the highways of Selma than to make a butchery of my conscience. I was saying in substance that we had to march, that conscience had called upon us to march, that for the sake of our nation and for the salvation of the state of Alabama, we had to make this kind of creative witness, and no matter what happened, if it meant that some of us were beaten again or arrested, or some of us had to face physical death, we had to do that in order to make this witness clear and in order to stand up for the truth as we saw it.
Well, Mrs. King was aware of this, of course.
Yes, she was aware of this whole thing, as she's been aware of the whole struggle and all of the things that I've been involved in the struggle.
Because wouldn't her fear, if she had any fear about this, be heightened by the fact that you are the leader of the movement?
But the interesting thing is that she's adjusted to this, and I guess she's adjusted by looking at it philosophically. She's realistic enough to know that emotions are high on this issue and that something can happen. There are many sick people in our society and people who are corroded with hatred, and they will use violence and they will assassinate leaders of a movement, so that my wife is very conscious of this, but it does not stop her in her commitment and going about her daily work. If one worried about these things all the time, they certainly couldn't function.
Couldn't deal with it, no.
Exactly. So you must go on with the faith that the cause is right, and if there's something happens in the process, it will serve that cause in a way that we may not be able to see at this time.
When Coretta Scott married Martin Luther King Jr. on June 18, 1953, she looked ahead to what she thought would be the full but quiet life of a minister's wife. But within a little more than 2 years, she had to adjust to the constant threat of violence, and then to the violence itself that exploded in her home in Montgomery, Alabama. Yoki, their firstborn, was 9 weeks old when it happened.
I remember early in the struggle when I guess it was right after our house was bombed. As a matter of fact, it was the night our house was bombed, when he rushed home, not knowing whether or not I had been injured, or the baby had been injured. This was Yoki. And when he came home, I was very calm and apparently relaxed as relaxed as one could be in a situation like that, with hundreds of people in the house and outside, and the press swarming around and so forth. So this made him feel, I think, quite relieved to know that I had adjusted to this so well. And then later in the night, when my father came and his father came, my father came from Marion and his father came from Atlanta, and we were talking about what the future might bring, and my father said to him, you see, they're after you, and you should just stop now and get in the background, let somebody else lead. And his father prevailed with him, and so my father said to me, well, Coretta, I came to get you and the baby, and I just wanted to take you over home to keep you for a few days until this thing sort of cools off. And of course I listened to him, and then I said to him, well, Dad, I can't go. I want to stay here with Martin because I feel this is where I should be, but I'll come in a few days. And well, of course, he understood and accepted this sort of reluctantly. And the next morning, of course, this was all a part of the same morning, but I mean, after it was day in the morning, we had breakfast, and Martin said, among many other things that were said, he said to me, well, Coretta, I don't know what I would have done without you. You've been a real soldier. And I realized then how much it meant to him for me to continue to be strong and to give him support, not only in terms of words, but in terms of actually feeling this way and being this way. I have the ability to remain calm in most crises, and he often says that I have the amazing ability to remain calm in a crisis, but when there is a major crisis, that is, but when there's a minor crisis, I seem to go to pieces. But I'm thankful that if I can do this and give the support that I am giving, that I feel that this is one of the most important roles that I can play.
Never was Coretta's support more needed than in March of 1965, when Martin was in Selma, Alabama, and caught up in the worst brutality he had seen in any campaign.
That's right. I would say we faced our most brutal moments in Selma. Never before had we had a campaign with such consistent brutality. Now, it's true that in Birmingham, lives were lost. The most tragic expression of that was that Sunday when 4 Negro girls were killed in church.
Bombing.
Yes, very
Gruesome,
tragic.
just how.
Yes. But in Selma, we faced more beatings. This was an everyday activity, so to speak, on the part of the law enforcement agents. And then when we finally decided to march to Montgomery, we faced all kind of brutality trying to get the march off the ground. It was during that period that Reverend James Reeb was clubbed down in Selma and finally died. He was in the march on Tuesday. And that Tuesday night, he was beaten, brutally beaten, and then died 2 days later. And then, of course, after the march, which was a tremendous success in terms of mobilizing the conscience of the nation, after we got to Montgomery, the diehards still wouldn't give up. And there was this incident when Mrs. Viola Liuzzo, who had been with us all the way on the march and who had been working in Selma, helping with the food for the marchers, started taking people back to Selma from Montgomery, and she was shot in her automobile on that Highway 80 that I mentioned earlier.
Now, in terms of your own adjustment to this exposure, after all, you are the leader of a movement You're the religious leader of your church, of your denomination. You've become known as a world religious leader. But you also are a father and a husband with equal commitments in both those directions. Now, have you become adjusted to this, not as a world religious leader, but as a father and a husband?
Well, I can tell you this, it's very difficult. I guess this was one of the most frustrating aspects of my life. The great demands that come as a result of my involvement in the civil rights movement and the struggle for justice and peace. I have to be away from home a great deal. I have to be out of town more than I'm in town. And this takes me away from the family so much. And it's just impossible to carry out the responsibilities of a father and husband when you have these kinds of demands. But fortunately, I have a most understanding wife who has given me consolation when I needed it most, and who has tried to explain to the children why I have to be absent so much. And I think in some way they understand, even though it's pretty hard on them.
I was coming to that because I wondered what their reaction was when their mother would have to explain that Daddy was in jail. After all, jail in this country it carries a mark of opprobrium for most citizens.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, she's done a very good job in getting them to realize the meaning of my jail going. She started out talking with them in very simple terms about the problems that we have in our society, the needs that many people face, and the fact that the Negro still faces tragic segregation and discrimination. And she always told them that Daddy was going to jail to help the people and to help change these conditions. And it was a very cute story that developed out of this whole thing. We have an amusement park here in Atlanta known as Fun Town. And for the first few years after opening, it was closed to Negroes. We passed by Fun Town a great deal going to the airport, and our daughter, our oldest daughter, Yolanda, always said, Daddy, take me to Fun Town. And she would say the same thing to her mother. And we tried to evade the issue by not letting her know that she couldn't go because she was colored. But finally, one day, we had to face it. And we explained to her why she couldn't go to Fun Town. And she had tears in her eyes when she discovered that she couldn't go because she was colored. But we assured her that we were going to continue to work to get it open. And then shortly after that, I was in jail in Albany, Georgia. And my wife started explaining to her that I was in jail that day. And her response was really wonderful. She had come to the point that she could laugh about it a little. She said, well, that's fine, Mommy, and tell him to stay in jail until I can go to Fun Town.
Martin dedicated one of his books to my children, for whom I dream that one day soon they will no longer be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Time has changed some of the ground rules, but this was Coretta's approach to the problem at the time.
Dexter and Bonnie both are too young to fully understand what has happened, but yet they do realize that there's such a thing as name calling, and sometimes Negroes are referred to as niggers, and they hear this kind of thing even by their little playmates. I remember this summer when we had a discussion about this, and my children were attending the YWCA downtown, which was formerly all white and is now integrated. And my oldest son, Marty, was saying that one little boy had called a friend of theirs, one of the Abernathy children, a nigger. And she had responded by calling him a cracker. And of course, I didn't like this kind of response because I know that, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, so it doesn't really work. As my husband often says, an eye for an eye will eventually leave everybody blind. So you have to cut off this chain some way, and I was trying to think of how to tell them to deal with this kind of problem if they are called niggers, when they go to this integrated school this fall. And I think my little son Dexter was the one who gave the best answer when he said, "You know something, Mommy?" And I said, "What's that, Dexter?" He said, "Some people say nigger because they don't know how to say Negro." And I think this is true. We have to realize that many of these children are products of their environment, and their parents have said these things before them. And in this new age, they will have to learn a lot, and they will have to understand that they are not supposed to call a Negro a nigger. And sometimes they say nigger, and they really aren't saying nigger, but it sounds like nigger. And those of us on the other side will have to be a little tolerant until they catch up.
Since Martin's assassination, Coretta has devoted herself to filling the void. For 13 years before his death, she was a working mother and an active partner. Martin dedicated his book, Stride Towards Freedom, to Coretta, my beloved wife and co-worker.
Incidentally, in terms of the peace demonstration in Washington, I noticed that your wife was there, but you were not. Had you intended to go, or was she representing you?
She was speaking for herself on the one hand, but on the other hand, she was certainly speaking for me in the sense that I agreed with everything she said, and I agree with the work that she's doing in this area.
Well, in connection with that, I came upon this yesterday, which is a copy of of her address.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered, as I read through it, whether you had any hand in the writing of it, or whether this stemmed from her, essentially.
No, I didn't have a hand in the writing of it. This stemmed from her, but I read it very thoroughly after she wrote it, and as I said, agreed with it absolutely and made certain suggestions, but this is basically her work.
Now, this leads me to ask you parenthetically this question. Did you educate Mrs. King to become equal to you in terms of sharing this burden, or did you research her before your marriage to see that she had the potential for this, or how did it come about?
Well, it may have been the other way. I think at many points she educated me. When I met her, she was very concerned about all of the things that we are trying to do now. I never will forget the first discussion we had when we met was the whole question of racial injustice and economic injustice and the question of peace. And in her college days, she had been actively engaged in movements dealing with these problems. So that I must admit, I wish I could say, and to satisfy my masculine ego, that I led her down this path, but I must say we went down together because she was as actively involved and concerned when we met as she is now.
Although Martin and Coretta did walk down the garden path together, their first meeting produced more doubt than fire. The odds at that point were heavily against their ever getting together.
I was not interested in marrying a minister at the time. I had, unfortunately, a stereotype impression of a minister, and I'm afraid that this impression was not a very good one. But when I met Martin, he didn't fit this stereotype.
He still doesn't.
Well, that's true. And I somehow, when I would think of him, I would always say to myself, but he is a minister. And I'm saying, he had all of the, I would say, the characteristics that a minister should have in terms of his outlook and his commitment and that sort of thing, but he didn't dress like I thought a minister not should have dressed, but the way the ministers had dressed that I had known, in a dark suit all of the time. And overly pious. Piety is good, but I think there's a kind of a false piety, you know, which I don't like. And he was just a human being, very, very warm and very down to earth and very easy to get along with, and just different somehow. So I liked him as a man and as a person. And so soon I forgot about this, the fact that he was a minister and I would be a minister's wife.
During the filming of my conversation with Martin, at one point, young Marty moved into the picture and snuggled up to his dad, just as we were discussing a quote from Mahatma Gandhi. The quotation reads, "Men say I am a saint losing myself in politics. The fact is I am a politician trying my hardest to be a saint." Martin recognized it immediately, and I suggested that in view of his recent history, the statement could have been made by Martin Luther King, Jr.
I certainly can't profess in any sense to be a saint. I never would be that arrogant, but like all religious leaders and religious people, I have a desire to reach the majestic heights of sainthood. And I feel the necessity at all times, and I guess this is what Gandhi was saying, to bring to bear upon all of the social and political issues of the day the great moral and ethical principles of our world and of the universe. And I think it's necessary for anyone who's working in these areas to have a keen sense of political timing. This was certainly one of the great points of genius within Mahatma Gandhi, that he did have this. He was an idealist and a realist at the same time. He combined in his character antitheses strongly marked. And I think this is necessary, and this is what he's getting at here. Now, I don't know how much I come to that point myself, but I've been greatly inspired naturally by his life and his teaching.
Well, I think it's an interesting daily battle to try and run the parallel between sainthood and fatherhood. And I think the demands of children upon a father sometimes can remove him from seeming like a saint.
Yes, well, I have to quite agree with that. Marty, I think you better run and get your homework now.
This is an instance of what I mean, you see, where the father is likely to be regarded less of a saint than a father.
Yes.
But actually, the idea of sainthood is not so much inherent in the individual as in the result of his work. Wouldn't you say that?
Yes. When one looks at the life of Gandhi, you do see self-sacrifice at its best. You see a man who is willing to give up all of the things that many people would hold dear in a materialistic setting in order to give his total life for the cause. And you see him coming to the point of assassination at the end. Now, this, of course, was sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice, but it was inflicted upon him by someone else. While I understand the desperation and the deep convictions, really, that lead individuals, whether they are in Vietnam or whether they're in America, to engage in an act of self-immolation, I must say that I don't think personally that this is the highest expression of creative sacrifice. For it is my conviction that we must always be willing to give our lives for a cause. If death is inflicted upon us as a result of our standing up, we must always be willing to do this, and certainly that death can become redemptive. But the process of taking one's own life to dramatize a situation is something that I have personal problems with, but at the same time, I feel the need of understanding the situation, the conditions, the real problems in our world that lead people to the point of feeling that they must go to this ultimate ominous point in order to dramatize their objection and their opposition to the continuation of war.
Well, now, you have certainly, by your acts, knowingly and consciously, and this has been one of the problems that your wife has faced, just being married to you, you've exposed yourself to the constant danger of assassination for doing and expressing the things that you believe in. Now, what if a situation had developed? This is a very difficult thing for anyone to be objective about, and you mentioned just now that you had personal problems about the subject of self-immolation. Could you see if you could see any advantage accruing to the civil rights movement by virtue of your death, what would your attitude be toward it?
Well, it depends on the form of the death. As I said, I have problems about the whole question of taking one's own life.
Well, possibly I do too. I think
yes.
You probably feel it as I do, that it's, in a sense, it's the height of violence.
Yes, taking one's own life.
Yes.
However, to willingly give your life, and I'm sure that there have been individuals in history who realized that they were giving their lives for what they considered truth and what they considered the highest and best. Socrates, for example. Jesus is another very powerful example of individuals who realized that they were going to face crucifixion or drink the hemlock, but they did it because they could not be untrue to that which conscience told them was right. And I think if I had to face such a decision, I would do the same thing. I wouldn't take my own life, but I would willingly give my life for that which I think is right. And I am convinced that when one does this honestly, that death can have a redemptive value, because I feel that unmerited suffering is redemptive.